Well, as bad as the president's budget looks, and it looks pretty bad. It adds about $7 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. It never achieves balance. As bad as it looks, it is in many ways helped out and looks better because of the budget rules and the fact that it works within a 10-year budget window. If you actually look at the deficit projections and the trajectory of the deficit projections under the president's budget, they come down for a little while. He gets down to the mid $500 billion range for budget deficits, which we all cheer because it's hardly $500 billion is hardly worth noticing these days, by 2018. And then it starts back up again. And by the time you hit the 2022 end of the 10-year budget window, he's back up in the mid $700 billion range. And that line is headed up. But of course, we just stop counting at 2022 and we pretend nothing ever happens after that. Well, what is the reason for that? It's that because beginning around 2020 is when the real entitlement problem in this country starts to kick in. That's when Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security really begin to take off. So he's only got a couple of years of that, and then whatever happens out beyond that, well, he doesn't have to pay any attention to. It's like we're racing towards a cliff, and just before we hit that cliff, the film breaks and stops. And then we just say, well, it didn't go off the cliff, so we don't have to worry about it. Unfortunately, the car is still headed in that direction, and that's where we're headed with the entitlements. Because the president's budget does not do anything about fundamentally altering the trajectory of entitlement programs. Now, in Medicare, the president does propose about $364 billion in Medicare cuts over the next 10 years. Now, that sounds like a lot in cuts until you realize that this year, Medicare will spend $480 billion. So the cuts proportionally are not all that large. He does propose, I will say, the president does propose some good ideas for Medicare reform in there. Some of the cuts he's making are decent ideas. He would change, for example, the way Medicare handles bad debt. People who don't pay their deductibles, for example, or their co-payments, or otherwise are supposed to pay part of their Medicare payments and don't, the government reimburses hospitals for the people's bad debt. And right now it reimburses at a much higher rate, about 3 times the rate of private insurance for that same debt. And the president proposes bringing it down and matching private insurance levels for that, which I think is a good idea. He would charge more for affluent seniors participating in the program, particularly on the Medicare prescription drug benefit, something that we've advocated for a while. So I do think there's some decent ideas in there. There are also some ideas that are not likely to pan out. He once again wants to squeeze reimbursement rates for physicians, which is something they've been trying to do for years. And he's got, of course, a number of we're going to be more efficient, we're going to weed out waste, fraud, and abuse ideas, which we've been trying to do since at least the Carter years, when I think he was the first president to say we're going to balance the budget on waste, fraud, and abuse. So we have to worry about that. And then, of course, there's a problem because a number of his proposed savings are going to be offset by increases in Medicare spending from savings that don't pan out under Obamacare. We've already had a CBO issued report in December suggesting that 2 of the president's proposals for how they were going to make Medicare more efficient and save money there do not actually save any money. So the $500 billion in predicted cuts under Obamacare for Medicare are not likely to actually occur. And therefore, they're going to more than offset any of the savings the president has proposed here. The net result is that by the end of the by the time we get to 2022, at the end of the 10-year budget cycle, Medicare is still going to be on a projection towards somewhere between, depending on which accounting measure you want to use, its total unfunded liabilities range somewhere between $50 and $90 trillion. Now, Social Security, on the other hand, is in slightly better shape. Its unfunded liabilities are only somewhere around $21 to $22 trillion. On the other hand, the president proposes absolutely no reforms of Social Security in his budget. So he just continues us racing down that cliff without even tapping at the brakes. Overall, if you add those together, by the way, you see we end up well over $100 trillion in the red. And in fact, if you throw in the budget deficit, which the president's proposing to be about $22 trillion, or $23 trillion by 2022, the actual on the books debt, we're going to be well up in the $130 trillion of budget or debt range, which is about 911% of GDP, just to put it in perspective there. But of course, one of the things we make, points we make at Cato is the fact that the debt and the deficit are not actually the problem facing this country. They're just a symptom of the disease, which is the question of the size of government. And if you look at what CBO has projected, they project that by 2050 in this country, we will have a federal government that consumes 42.2% of GDP. If you throw in state and local governments, will be over 60% of GDP, which is a larger government than any country in Europe has today. So we will have a bigger welfare state than, say, France or Sweden does by 2050. The president's budget does not do anything to change the trajectory of that increase. He might bring it down by 1%, maybe 2%, because of the cuts in discretionary spending and some of the interest savings. But because he does not fundamentally change the trajectory of the 3 entitlement programs, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, which are driving that cost, and therefore does not change ultimately the amount of interest we have to pay, the big 4 drivers in spending, we are going to end up with a federal government that's still going to be over 40% of GDP by the mid-century. So fundamentally, the question is, are you going to simply take your 10-year savings, play around with whatever cuts, I think we need to make the cuts, but whatever cuts you're making in domestic discretionary spending, hopefully you start trimming defense as well, but just get to 2022 and say, whew, we've solved the problem, or are you going to deal with those fundamental entitlement programs that take you off the cliff out beyond that 10-year budget window? The president has essentially abdicated any leadership on the entitlement issue. He's tried to pretend that 2023 and beyond don't exist. Unfortunately, they do, and if we don't fix them, we're going off that cliff.